Great. Well, it's so good to see everybody again. It's my pleasure today to introduce Graeme Auld. He is a professor in Carleton University's School of Public Policy and Administration, where he co-leads the Decentred Governance in a Digital Era project lab. Graeme has broad interests in comparative environmental politics and global environmental governance, with a particular focus on the emergence, evolution, and impacts of transnational private governance regimes and the contentious politics surrounding and underpinning these developments. We are very excited to have you, Graeme, and the floor is yours.
Super. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks for the invite. And I'll share my screen in a second. Just a quick acknowledgement that I'm here visiting or meeting with you from Ottawa, Canada, which is on the unceded and traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. And I'm going to do, my talk is going to I don't think it's going to take the full time, but I just want to say that if anyone really has a pressing question, like a clarification question, I'm reasonably good at seeing hands raised while we're going through. So please put your hand up, and I don't mind stopping and dealing with questions of clarification in the moment. And then we can always, I can always say, I'm going to get to that, or let's save those questions for the end. Okay. So now I will share 1 second. Okay. So the talk title that I'm presenting today is Reflections on the Evolving Public-Private Field of AI Regulation. The central argument that I want to sort of put forward for all of you today is this this idea that really to understand AI governance now and in the future, we need to study this as an evolving process that arises out of public and private interactions. And I say that's important now more than ever, partly because a lot of attention has shifted to what governments are doing. In Canada, there's ADA, the Artificial Intelligence Data Act. In the EU, many of you are probably aware of all that's happened in the EU with the AI Act. Other countries are moving as well. The UK sector by sector approach with this sort of pro-innovation approach to AI regulation. The executive order in the US. All of these are examples of governments moving to set rules, regulations, expectations around risks and harms of AI systems. But even though these are really important public interventions, I want to suggest that private actors remain really important. And I'm going to sort of highlight how I think we can think about that through the lens of public and private interactions, and particularly looking at this as different kinds of pathways that those interactions might follow. Okay. So the motivation here is that the other motivation for me, sort of intellectually and academically, is that AI, obviously there's been a lot of attention to the sort of novel risks that AI presents. But I think that many who are in this space are also thinking about what are the things that we can use metaphor, analogy, other sectors, other examples to say, well, what are the past experiences that we have that could inform how we think about AI regulation in particular and AI risks in particular. So the questions that have been central in my mind for a while are what's similar, dissimilar about AI when we think about other regulatory risks. And how can we learn from these experiences of past risk regulation to understand the potential politics of risk regulation and the consequences of different forms of regulatory intervention? And as Calvin highlighted at the outset, right, a lot of my previous work has been on sustainability issues and the development of transnational forms of regulation, to deal with those risks, harms, environmental challenges. And when I say transnational, I'm specifically meaning things that's institutions that span national borders that involve actors that are in different jurisdictions. And typically those are issues where there's trade involved or there's some kind of distant effect or harm that's connected to consumption in some other part of the world. And there's been a lot of attention to these kinds of initiatives in the sustainability space. And that's partly why I got really interested in, well, what can we learn from those experiences when we think about how AI might evolve, the governance of AI specifically. So what I'm going to do in the remaining talk is I'm going to give a little bit of a background, some conceptual starting points. So think about particularly the information side or the information challenges as a key part of risk regulation. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of distinction between governance versus government. Introduce the pathways framework specifically that builds off work that has already been published, but that I think is useful for all of our thinking. And then think about the future. So what might stabilize or destabilize the current patterns of regulation that we're witnessing, and then offer some concluding thoughts. Okay. So when I think about regulating risk, one of the things that I often think about is the challenge has a lot to do with the fact that there are things that are invisible, particularly in the user, but you can think about that more broadly along the AI lifecycle. Sometimes, for instance, the user of data might not really understand all the components of the data that they're using. And in that respect, there's something invisible about that data that matters for how that user of that data might use it, develop a model off it, et cetera. So this challenge of essentially information problems, sometimes economists call these information asymmetries, between producers, developers, are kind of a central challenge that risk regulation needs to sort of grapple with. And the other challenge that I really want to home in on too is this idea that there's certain aspects that are often called what are called credence qualities or credence attributes, where it's not just that it's invisible, say, for instance, when we buy a product, but it's also invisible. It's very difficult to discover those qualities through using the product. So in that respect, you need some mechanism in order to make those attributes visible to users and also make them credibly visible, because we often hear about in the sustainability space the idea of greenwashing. I don't know what the exact term in the AI context is, but the idea that there's an incentive to sell something as something that it is not. And in that respect, we need some mechanism to communicate credibly that those invisible attributes are as we expect them to be, right? So in my thinking, like an illustration of this that comes from sustainability, but I think may resonate. So we can think about this as kind of a very general problem in governance, right? If you think about these two glasses of milk, right, they look exactly the same if we didn't have such a thing as a nutritional label. So if you were someone who happened to have high cholesterol and we didn't have nutritional labels, you might be worried that you were drinking whole fat milk that had higher levels of cholesterol versus low fat milk or no fat milk that has low levels of cholesterol. So that invisible quality of milk is made visible through this nutrition label. And that's, I think, at the heart of some of the debates currently about how we think about trust and safety and responsible AI is how do we develop these mechanisms such that we can assure someone down the value chain of an AI product that the thing that they think they're getting is what they're getting, in the sense that they're not deploying an AI system that may be biased in a way that would be invisible to them in use. In the sustainability space, a lot of the attention has been placed on thinking about products that we might have otherwise thought of undifferentiated. So in this case, you could think of these two chairs as exactly the same. They look the same. They may be made from the same wood. They may be made from the same essential quality. So in the sense that they're just as strong, just as durable, they have the same finish, etc. But in that case, some of the things that we think about from an ethical lens are things that are in the process by which those chairs were developed. So this is a fictitious label, but this is a label that I made a while ago just to illustrate the point that you could imagine one of those chairs communicating a different set of messages about invisible qualities of that chair, including things like worker safety, things like riparian buffer zones for protecting habitat, protected areas in a forest area where the harvesting happened, etc. So the point again is to highlight that a lot of risk regulation is about these invisible attributes that we care about. So to come back sort of full circle to where I started with in terms of my own work, a lot of the reason I've become really interested in AI is partly because a lot of the same dynamics that we saw for the last 30 years in the context of sustainability with the development of the labels that you see in front of you on this slide are happening or just started to happen in the AI context and led to lots of conversations about what we can learn from programs like the Forest Stewardship Council that you see, FSC, or others in this space that might be useful to think about for designing and informing the way we think about AI governance. So the last piece of the puzzle here that I just want to highlight is that this sort of focus on governance is important because in the last several decades, there have been a number of things that have transformed the capacity of the state to do certain kinds of governance. And the rise of the labels that you saw on the last page have a lot to do with these factors. So for instance, the rise of particular forms of neoliberal governance at the international level. So the preference for free trade or regulated free trade, different ideas about the appropriate role of government. So government allowing more private sector engagement instead of the metaphor that people use is steering, not rowing a canoe. The other dimension is the sort of rise of globalization and supply chains and how that's transformed who the key players are. So in the sustainability space, we often talk about the big global brands like Walmart. The large retailers have played a pivotal role in shaping and shifting the conversations around what's acceptable practices in supply chains. And some of them obviously have capacities that far exceed certain states. And you can think analogously in the tech and AI context, right? There's certain small players that have a lot of power. The platform, kind of the ideas of platform governance, those really map onto the same sort of discussions that have happened in sustainability for the last several decades. And the last point here is that there has been a transformation in the NGO world where there's a lot more large NGOs that have capacities that expand and exceed sort of their particular jurisdiction. And a lot of them have begun tactically to move towards working directly with firms or targeting firms rather than necessarily thinking about the first point of engagement being the state or government. So to come full circle back to this idea of governance, not government, it's useful to step back from thinking about just governments as the rule makers when we think about AI risk regulation. And that's important not only for the reasons I just identified in the recent history of sustainability, but we also know that there's a long, long history in areas like technical risk standards that come from organizations like ISO or IEEE and others that come with different kinds of inclusivity in terms of how how the actual standards are set, but also different compliance incentives. Why firms adopt a particular ISO standard may have reasons to, or the reasons for doing that are different from the threat of some kind of penalty from a government or some kind of other state-led sanctioning mechanism. The other thing that I think is really important here is that we know that governance, particularly when it spans national borders, can involve a range of actors that engage with rulemaking in different ways. And so taking account of this larger governance field can enhance our ability to understand the possible future of AI governance. So one conceptualization of that I think might be useful for all of you to sort of think about is we can think about disaggregating governance in a way that has these six, I should say, six sort of functional categories / actors. And I say that they're functional categories because it's not to say that one actor is always going to be a rule maker or is always going to be a target of rules. Sometimes an individual actor can be both a rule maker as well as a target of rules. So for instance, right, governments in the context of AI are both setting expectations for firms and how they develop and use AI in the context of specific sectors, but they are also setting rules for their own behavior in the sense of, in the Canadian context, the directive on automated decision making is a rule that's directed at how government uses AI in its own service delivery, in its own practices internal to the government. So disaggregating what we mean by who makes rules and who are the targets of rules helps us map out the different contexts, in different contexts, how governance plays out. I should say that this comes from work by Tim Buth, who's a scholar at the University of Munich, with the exception of just one additional category that we've added in our own thinking around the distinction between those that make the rules and those that check the rules to determine whether compliance is happening. And sometimes those are the same actors, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're separate. So the slide sort of illustrates not only that they can overlap, that they can be distinct, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of actors that might play the different roles in governance when we look at different contexts in which this might apply. So turning this more specifically to the AI context, we can think about some examples, right, of what we mean by that in a more less abstract, in a more concrete sense. And I'll come back to some of these examples when we get further along, but this is just to sort of give you a sense of where some actors might be situated, right? So clearly in the rule makers category, we can think about some of the organizations and states that I've already talked about. So international standard setters like the IEEE or ISO. There's the EU Act, obviously, that's setting particular expectations around AI risks. There's local governments, New York City's local law 144 that deals with automated decision-making and employment decisions. There's ADA in Canada. There's the Responsible AI Institute, which has developed sort of a certification program that itself can be used by other, the intention is that it could be used by other organizations that would want to do rule checking. In the rule checking category, there's organizations that have sort of set up their own systems to establish safety and trust in AI. United Laboratories has one that's focused specifically on AI algorithms and ensuring a narrow issue like that it is will reliably perform the tasks that it's set out to do. So in that context, it's a specific, very focused set of standards as well as rule checking. Babel AI, Armilla, and Holistica AI have also very different kinds of approaches. Armilla, for instance, is one that's offering sort of warranties around similar to UL in the sense that it's saying that what you're getting is what you think you're getting, but the specifics of how they do that are quite different. So in this respect, it's important to show how sometimes the rule-making function can actually be quite separate from the rule checkers might be doing their own thing that complements, enhances, say, for instance, compliance, legal verification against particular legal requirements, but they may also be offering very separate, specific services that are more like a market transaction, saying you want to be able to credibly communicate to buyers independent of your legal requirements. They will offer services of that sort as well. And then we can also think about sort of who's demanding these rules. I just put in two examples of NGOs that have been active here, Amnesty International and Access Now. Of course, targets, users, and stakeholders are a much larger category that has to be thought of very specifically when we think about individual risks, individual AI applications. And again, those bubbles can expand and contract and take different forms depending on the sector-specific dynamics that we're thinking about. So to sort of sum up that kind of conceptual foundation that I wanted to start with, I want to just reiterate that we can see rules coming from sources other than government. And why that matters, particularly when we think about this from an ethical perspective, we have to recognize that these different venues, you can think about them as decision-making venues, are going to come with particular biases. And those biases are maybe a reflection of the scope and focus that they're concerned about, but they also may be a function of other things, like who they include and exclude in terms of who has the right to have a voice, right to participate. And when we think about something like the distinction between international technical standards, who can participate in those versus who has a voice in a regulatory process within Canada or in the United Kingdom or the EU, those are going to be quite different in terms of what kinds of voices are going to have a legitimate stake in shaping and affecting the rules that come out of those different venues. And the same can apply if we think about multi-stakeholder initiatives, NGOs, industry or professional associations. So if we see an industry association that's for software developers or one that's focused on accounting professionals, those are going to come with a particular set of ideas as well as a particular community from which they are going to build their ideas about appropriate rules. And that's going to shape the kinds of ethical things that they foreground and the other ones that may be invisible to them. So these biases, right, can have explicit or implicit ethical implications where we're thinking about ethics in a very broad sense to not only think about whether there's bias in the application, but also whether they're inclusive in the development process, how we determine what ends they ought to address, what specific specifications are going to have to meet in terms of quality control, et cetera, and why we're making those decisions. So what are the foundational values that we're thinking about when we're deciding what is appropriate and not appropriate? And we need to be aware of those biases because those different rulemaking venues, even though it might seem very valuable to have a multiplicity of different rulemaking venues in this context for diversity's sake or for perhaps experimentation and learning, depending on which ones emerge as the ones that gain traction, that can have consequences for how we regulate AI. So I'm going to turn now to the sort of second major theme in this talk, and that is to sort of thinking about pathways as one way to understand how actors engage with efforts to develop AI governance. And the work here is very much informed by previous work on sustainability. And I should be very clear that the discussion that's going to follow is just going to home in on to specific types of actors, it's not going to think about that full array of actors that I identified in those bubble diagrams a second ago. And obviously, there's lots of interesting questions to ask and explorations to do to think about the motivations of different kinds of actors. For instance, the motivations of professionals like lawyers or accountants, engineers. How do they feature in shaping the kinds of biases that get built in or do not get built into AI systems? But in this case, I'm thinking particularly about the motivations of corporate and civil society actors in using private governance, sort of this idea of generating rules outside the state to influence the way in which AI governance develops. And the premise is that these and other actors will have interests in seeing the rules made by certain rulemaking venues because the biases may favor their interests/concerns. And as I've said, they come from kind of a long-standing literature now that looks at how private governance is developed in the sustainability world. And in that context, there are a diverse set of perspectives on this, but two prominent perspectives that are highlighted in the literature are the idea that private governance is not sort of is best understood as a unintended outcome or a settlement of power and conflict struggles. So we can't necessarily think about what we see in private governance as a reflection of a very careful design by a rational actor, but rather it's the outcome of conflict. It's the outcome of contestation between different actors trying to get their way, right? Another perspective is this functional perspective where you can think about private governance as specifically designed to deal with very specific problems. And that those two perspectives, we tried to sort of weave them together to give insights into how we think about different pathways for the interaction of public and private in using private governance to sort of influence state behavior. Okay. So the three pathways. The first one is this idea that civil society and corporate actors both have motivations to, in general, oppose or fend off state interventions. And you can think of that, this might seem very intuitive on the corporate side because we do hear a lot about companies trying to prevent regulation from coming in that might harm their bottom lines, reduce their competitiveness, impose restrictions that make it more difficult to do what they do well. The civil society side is a little bit more a product of an understanding that some understand the state as not necessarily the most effective intervention in certain cases, partly because of the perception that the states can be captured by business or ultimately ineffective in dealing with certain problems. So the extent to which these motivations exist on the corporate and civil society side, we can see our expectation is that we'll see adversarial or mutual and strategic adaptation and a lack of cooperation between state and these corporate and civil society actors. And particularly on the sort of strategy and tactics side, private governance will be sort of seen as an opportunity to develop and maintain what we can almost think of as quasi-regulatory structures to govern problems. And in the context of sort of longer sustainability literature, there's many examples of both of those dynamics. Organizations like the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, were in large measure motivated by certain actors that were worried that intergovernmental efforts in the late 1980s and early 1990s were too slow and were largely going to be ineffective in dealing with large problems of forest degradation. And you can see some indications of this in certain actions like the direct targeting of large tech firms by Greenpeace. They had a report that came out called Oil in the Cloud, where instead of trying to advocate for stricter rules from government, they targeted the firms directly to try and change their behavior around specific practices on who they should or should not be developing AI tools for. In particular, they didn't want AI tools to help oil and gas companies more efficiently discover new oil reserves. The motivation being they wanted to slow down continued extraction of fossil fuels. And in the context of the firms, early on, we saw sort of before the sort of uptick in government action, we did see a lot of efforts by firms individually and some cases collectively to develop their own internal ethics boards, other self-governance mechanisms to try and fend off the perception that there was a problem that needed state intervention. The second pathway is this push and engage pathway. And in this context, the motivations are slightly different. States, from a civil society perspective, are viewed as needed to ensure actions at scale, even if compromise on objectives is necessary. So there's a trade-off here, but the sense that states and regulation enable action at a larger scale than is possible by individual private governance efforts, even if this means that maybe the rules are not quite as stringent. On the corporate motivation side, there's the view that sometimes intervention by state can be quite effective in regulating competition, creating certainty around the business environment and business climate, as well as making sure that there isn't unfair disadvantage for those firms that are acting responsibly vis-a-vis those that aren't. So leveling the regulatory playing field. And largely interactions here are cooperative efforts to see interlocking of state regulatory structures with efforts by the private sector and civil society. And it's the sort of idea of informing, facilitated institutionalization of regulatory level playing field. And our read of the sort of situation to date is this is the most active pathway in the AI context, in that there clearly have been efforts by firms and NGOs to inform government's efforts to regulate by speaking about the pre-existing practices that firms are doing, trying to provide roadmaps by saying, we have an existing set of best practices. These can inform how you think about regulating in this context. Very specific areas, say, for instance, the firms in the technical testing, inspection and certification council, the TIC sector members have been vocal in supporting, say, the EU AI Act around the role of third-party audits in that emerging regulatory regime. So in this case, most of the sort of private action that we see, in particularly private governance, has been in lockstep or seeking to find ways to institutionalize more effective regulatory interventions. The final way to think about a pathway is this lead and inspire. So in this case, civil society motivations view the state as a means to institutionalize experiments proven feasible by private actors. And corporate motivations view the states as strategically valuable to support new business models and niche market creation. So unlike the previous, where there was an effort to sort of institutionalize a baseline, an understanding of regulatory playing field, in this case, states may be used to provide barriers to entry, to support or protect niche markets that otherwise would have a difficulty competing with mass market producers. So the lead and inspire role of private governance is an opportunity to rethink how we think about a particular problem and set standards and create barriers to entry that are credible around those standards, such that in the marketplace, you can see differentiation between those products and, say, mass-produced just products that are meeting regulatory expectations. So in the sustainability context, like examples of this would come from the history of the organic movement, where there were efforts to try and develop completely alternative markets where there were differentiation between those markets and industrial agriculture, and that the incentives, obviously, for corporations, if they can authentically demonstrate that they are a part of that community, they may be able to differentiate and exert price premiums or more market share in those niche markets than they would otherwise be able to obtain, right? From a perspective of interacting with the state, there's sort of a component where this is an effort to inspire or redefine regulatory possibilities. So in the absence of these actions, it might seem very impractical or impossible that such practices would be possible in the future. But the demonstration effect, the ability to make clear that another set of, say, ethical principles around AI might be achievable is one of the key motivations here. And so some illustrations that we've thought about in this context in the AI would be things like DARE, which is the specific institute that was set up to rethink how we think about the actual practice of doing AI research. So it's not just about the product, but it's also about the specific research approach. So in that case, there's even this idea of like trying to think about generating what's called a slow AI movement, where you think about ethics in terms of even the researchers themselves and how they're treated, the communities that you are engaging with when developing those tools. So all of those are examples of outside of the box or beyond the current thinking about what we mean by ethics and what standards we ought to regulate in that regard, that may seem impractical or impossible currently, but their existence makes it possible that in the future they might inspire change or demonstrate another way of thinking about this regulatory problem. So taking into account those three different pathways, I think it's pretty clear at the moment that the general shift has been towards action along pathway 2. But I really want to emphasize that this does not mean that private action is fading into the background. So for instance, in the UK, with their pro-innovation approach, they are strongly emphasizing a vision that has a thriving and effective AI assurance ecosystem. And by that, they mean strong existing professional service firms. So you can think of, when they say that, they're thinking about probably the firms in the accounting sector like Ernst & Young, KPMG, Deloitte, et cetera, alongside new innovative startups, more like the ones that I had on the slide before, Armilla AI, Holistica AI, others, right, that will provide a range of services to build justified trust in AI. So in that respect, the UK's regulatory approach is going to be hybrid, in that many of the things that are going to be required are thought of as reaching an overall balance between innovation and risk mitigation will include a series of assurance systems that are not necessarily run by state regulatory agencies. Similarly, in the EU, has been specifically engaging Sensenelec to develop harmonized EU standards for the purpose of demonstrating compliance with the EU AI Act, a practice that in the EU is very consistent with its long-standing new legislative framework that was adopted in 2008 to govern goods in the European market. And that idea of using technical standards as a way of establishing baseline assurances of compliance, again, highlights how there's this interaction between public and private. Questions obviously can be asked, will this persist? we can think about this, right? At the moment, it seems maybe people are talking about a Brussels effect. We're talking about the sort of certain first movers potentially having advantages in the context of AI risk regulation. But will this occur? Is this a sort of a stable situation, or are there other ways in which it might be destabilized? So in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then just offer some conclusions. So if we thought about why particular rules might become stable, we can at least think of three things that could matter here. First, there is obviously incentives, particularly for firms that operate in more than one jurisdiction, multinationals being the most prominent in that regard, will have interest in creating similar regulatory requirements and or at the very least, mutual recognition arrangements, both on the standards, so what the risk regulations say they have to do in terms of what the thresholds are, what kinds of risks they have to mitigate, what kinds of risk, what they do when particular risks are in play, and the process is for demonstrating compliance. So that all those questions around assurance systems, right? Conformity assessment, those the more those differ across jurisdictions, the more costs they impose on firms that need to adapt their systems across those different jurisdictions. Another thing that would sort of enhance stability is that sort of at some point in the near future, if there was a focal institution that emerged, this could be multilateral. I know there's discussions about the OECD AI Observatory. Other multilateral institutions might emerge as this place in which certain aspects of AI become the focus of discussion for states, or particular private standard institutions may emerge and become the sort of deferred to place where certain forms of AI standards get established. The extent to which that becomes a focal institution that would help provide stability in this context. The final point would be that kind of network effects, and that's a sort of catch-all for things that lead to incentivize perpetuation of a system. So network effects in particular are situations where when more actors adopt a particular practice, it becomes more and more beneficial for others to do the same. So that the classic examples of those are sort of technological lock-in, where the QWERTY example of when a number of people learn how to type on a QWERTY typewriter, that gives incentives for firms to hire people that are able to type on QWERTY typewriters, buy QWERTY typewriters, and that creates a snowball effect that everyone has an incentive to adopt the same standard. So you can imagine in certain kinds of AI standards that might be the place. It certainly would not be in certain ones where there's clear incentives to shirk or say you're doing it, but not actually adopt because it's less costly to do another option. The second thing that might lead to sort of stability in this context is sort of the power of particular incumbents. So technology firms or large firms in the assurance ecosystem may help to stabilize the system around certain best practices just because of their sheer market power. And that obviously could also lead to other ethical consequences, but that certainly would stabilize us on certain standards. Equally, though, we can think about conditions for instability. So the first one to think about is shifting governance demands. We've already seen that the capacities of AI have changed dramatically, particularly since the development of the EU Act began to take hold. So the whole launch of generative AI shifted understandings of the risks and risk thresholds, and that we can think of playing forward in the future, and that would really affect how or whether we thought the current set of standards and arrangements were sufficient for the changing risk profile. The second is itself sort of a product of the way in which the regulations are adopted and implemented. The very fact that once they become real and in practice, that can foment a cycle of contention that highlights either to firms who think that a particular set of regulations are too onerous, or say civil society actors that think they're inadequate, will lobby for or act on their interests to try and change those regulatory requirements going forward. The second would be obviously that if there were major crises associated with the technology, that could certainly have a dramatic effect on our sense of what the risks are or what the appropriate risk thresholds are. And that again would probably lead to some revisions, changes that would destabilize any pathways that we're currently on. The final point was that we've been talking mostly about a small set of states, a few set of actors that have been trying to think about how to regulate AI. And as I mentioned before, the fact that these institutions have particular biases, either real or perceived, or a lack of legitimacy, could shape the proliferation of local alternative rules in different jurisdictions, different sectors, and different professions. So each of these highlights how, when we think forward, it's important to understand what are the things that might help perpetuate the system as it is, and what things might push us in a very different direction. So to conclude, obviously the nature and scope of AI systems is continuing to grow and growing quite rapidly. And how we think about these technologies will shape the kinds of regulatory interventions we feel ought to be adopted. But momentum can also build as private actors gain interest in particular forms of regulatory interventions, as I said, through network effects and positional power. And will these forces limit ability to adjust down the road? We don't know for sure, but we can also remember that there are many sources of instability, both in the design of the rules themselves and their potential ineffective implementation, but also exogenous shocks like focusing events that could require a rethink of how we're thinking about AI, not only as an innovation that can help, but also as a source of risk for society. So thinking in terms of pathways can help clarify these possibilities and give us insight for what we can expect going forward. So just to close, I want to just thank collaborators that I've worked on these and related projects. So Amanda Clark, Benjamin Favre, Ashley Cassavan, and Stefan Renkens. Work has been supported by SSHRC grants, both a Connection grant and Insight grant. And I just offered a few references at the end in case anyone wants to do some additional reading. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Graham, thank you so much for this. This is very interesting, and I'm sure plenty of folks in our group will find this relevant and have plenty of thoughts to share. I will stop this recording and we'll move to questions.